You know, people say that there are only two constants in life, are death and taxes. But today, on the 106th anniversary of the armistice of the Great War, also called World War I, we are reminded maybe there's another constant on this list: war. I confess I always feel a little bit uncomfortable speaking on Remembrance Sunday. I'm expected to say things, and you can expect me to say things that are nurturing, truthful, inspiring, helpful, pastoral. But I personally have no direct or even indirect experience with war. I have very distant family members who fought in wars. None of them were casualties, and I'm not sure I even spoke to them in my entire lives. They're very distant. I've done a lot of research, of course, including listening to a 30-hour podcast I highly recommend called Blueprint for Armageddon. But my main education comes from speaking with people in churches and other places over many, many years. This year in particular, it's very hard to speak, because right now here in Canada, we are providing financial support, legal support, and political cover for genocide happening in Gaza as we speak. And it's difficult to speak about honoring and remembering our own dead while we are making brand new ones. And the government of Canada, you will probably know, has decided it is not interested in following international law. And so we are now currently in violation of international law, expressly so we can support a state to commit a genocide. The phrase "never again" surely means never again for anyone, or else it is completely meaningless. I know when it comes to war, truth is relative. As they say, truth is the first casualty of war. They also say one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. I know that when it comes to war, truth is very selective. Because in any war, we need to maintain the image that we are somehow on high moral ground while we commit atrocities to fellow human beings. And I know that both sides do the same thing. On so many occasions in history, before a battle, both sides have knelt in prayer, praying to their God for victory, and they're praying to the same God. And I know for a fact that all of us here have some idea what today represents, and that's great. So I'm going to begin, as we often do here, with some history, so I don't get too emotional. Doing war, you know, is a very old profession. If you study the history of war and warfare, for thousands of years, most wars had many, many features in common. Wars consisted of separate battles between trained combatants. These battles happened in relatively small spaces away from civilian populations. And so historically, the total amount of destruction in each battle was limited. Most battles happened during the space of a single day, often being decided in hours. Now, yes, I know we also had situations where there would be a siege on a city and many civilians were killed. But most wars, historically, consisted of battles, separate battles, each of which was contained in time and space, and therefore a limited amount of damage. For example, I know you can't see that, but it's a map. There's a little pink area there. The end of the Napoleonic Wars was the Battle of Waterloo, which happened on a single day, June 18th, 1815. The battlefield was about 4 kilometers across. Approximately 190,000 people fought that day. 20,000 were killed, 40,000 were wounded, all of them military personnel. If we fast forward almost exactly 100 years, we get to World War I, a war that redefined what humans think the word war means. Because of many changes, including technology, mechanization, global commerce, and the rise of wealth capitalism, World War I battles were the first to really be different. World War I grew to be a war that included a battle on a front line that extended 700 kilometers, that went on for years, that involved millions of people, including many civilians. And this was a significant change. War has sometimes been compared to boxing, where in boxing, if you get a quick knockout in the first round, it's actually the most merciful outcome. Because if a boxing match goes many rounds, both boxers take a lot of damage as they grind each other down. Prior to World War I, most battles were like the quick knockout. But by World War I, the nation states involved had the economic and social durability to take a lot of punches and keep fighting. World War I was the first war where both sides ground each other to dust, utilizing 65 million troops from 21 countries. Those 65 million people would produce approximately 20 million dead and 40 million wounded. The single bullet fired by a guerrilla precept in Sarajevo led to a gruesome tragedy beyond anyone's imagination. The scale of World War II was something new to human experience. At the outbreak of World War I, many generals were using strategies from the past, of course, but cold, hard experience on battlefields taught many lessons. Lessons that had to be learned by trial and error. And you know error means a lot of people die. Safe to say, though, that nobody understood what they were getting into for sure. But they certainly found out. For example, consider this image. This is a picture of French cavalry at the beginning of World War I. Look at what they're wearing. Actually, the fact they're cavalry at all is one thing. Look what they're wearing. They have feather plumes in their helmets. They're wearing shiny metal breastplates and helmets. This is black and white, but they're wearing bright red pants. They're carrying swords. One source said you'd have to be an expert on military history to notice any difference between these guys and the cavalry at the time of Napoleon. In the past, people wore bright clothes into battle to scare your enemy by making them think there's even more of you than there are. During World War I, these uniforms were exchanged for drab colors to help soldiers not be seen. In the days of machine guns, camouflage is better protection than shiny metal and red pants. World War I actually created a lot of really interesting images. One of my favorites is this picture of a German cavalry on horseback wearing a gas mask, which just somehow seems very dystopian. Other images show the humanity of the combatants too. This image is from the so-called Christmas truce from 1914, a spontaneous act of camaraderie between British and German soldiers, much to the disgust of their officers. They decided it's Christmas, we're not going to kill each other. It is heartwarming to see that Christmas mattered. They shared chocolates, cigarettes, they even sang Christmas carols together. It's somewhat less heartwarming, of course, to realize that the European countries involved in World War I were all predominantly Christian, and yet felt compelled to murder each other anyway. And I just cannot imagine sharing chocolates, cigarettes, and singing songs together one day, and the next day, those two gentlemen were trying to kill each other. This picture, to me, is a visual representation of the insanity of war. Other changes happened during the war, too, of course. In previous wars, combatants often acted with a good deal of honor. War was in many cases seen as an honorable profession. But as World War I became a battle along a front line that didn't move, the killing intensified, the horror and the glory of warfare faded fast. During the Middle Ages, the idea of two highly trained warriors with swords fighting to the death may in fact have been an act of honor. But being mowed down by a machine gun from an enemy you cannot even see does not speak to honor. There was no honor in gassing other people the way we spray ants with a can of Raid. Millions of people being pushed into a meat grinder does not speak of honor. George Evans, a 94-year-old veteran from the UK, famously reflected on this, and he said, "I remember my friends and my enemies too. We all did our duty for our countries. We obeyed our orders and we murdered each other. Isn't war stupid?" World War I also redefined our understanding of who dies in war, because previously battles happened on battlefields, as I said, and most of the people who were injured or died were combatants. This changed radically with World War I, because the ability of nations to really take a punch meant not only that wars lasted a long time, but the ability to keep fighting depended on a constant supply of food, ammunition, many resources that were manufactured by civilians. This is what came to be known as the home front. But that also meant civilians now became legitimate targets. Warfare had become total warfare for most of the nations involved. Estimates of the dead from World War I vary quite a bit, but most estimates say that of those 20 million dead, half were civilians, half were involved more directly. I realize that for many people, Remembrance Day is an opportunity to honor combatants from a number of wars, including World War II and other wars, and I completely respect that. But in my mind, World War I truly was the Great War in the sense it created a shift in the nature of warfare and how we understand war at all. Moreover, in many respects, the war that began in 1914 is actually still with us today. That may surprise you given it's the 106th year of the armistice. But there is a piece of history we don't usually like to tell. Because at the end of World War I, there was, of course, a peace treaty drawn up known as the Treaty of Versailles. And the treaty was, by all sides, considered much too harsh towards Germany, even by allies. For example, the French general, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, said, "This treaty is not a peace, it's an armistice of 20 years, which was a stunningly good estimate of when war would break out again. The way that World War I ended led directly to the start of World War II. And World War II, of course, led directly to the threat of nuclear Armageddon and the Cold War, which still affects us today. World War I, dubbed the war to end all wars, in my mind should be called the war to end all peace, because we have not truly known global peace since 1914. There's one other aspect of World War II that completely removed any traces of honor from it, summarized nicely in this cartoon. Because while U.S. soldiers, for example, were earning $30 a month, if you're on the front lines, you got $1 a day. While they were earning $1 a day fighting for their country, other Americans were making a killing of their own. During World War I, at least 21,000 Americans became millionaires, and some of them billionaires. To quote decorated veteran Major Smedley Darlington Butler, author of the book War is a Racket, and this is back in 1935, quote, "How many of these millionaires shouldered a rifle or dug a trench? How many of them knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? How many of them spent sleepless, frightened nights ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun fire?" There's a story that somebody said to Vladimir Lenin once, "War is terrible," and Lenin allegedly replied, "Yes, terribly profitable." Whether or not Lenin actually said that, wealth capitalists took that lesson to heart big time. The high ideals for which soldiers fought for was counterbalanced by those driven by profits. World War I was also a watershed in that during the war, global wealth, which, go back to 1900, was concentrated in London, after centuries of theft from around the world, of course, that global theft moved from London to New York. And much of the developed world was indebted to the U.S. at the end of World War I through loans, to the tune of $11.5 billion. Today, that would be $250 billion. We might like to think that since humanity has been practicing warfare like forever, we might be good at it. And on the surface, it always sounds so easy. When we see evil in our midst, we take up arms and fight evil, which is why our story in Matthew seems so strange today. In the parable, a farmer saw weeds among the crops and suggested moving the weeds. But Jesus said, "You cannot remove the weeds without damaging the crop." In World War I, as many civilians were killed as evil combatants. In World War I and every war since, including the War on Terror, trying to remove evil has inflicted even more suffering on innocent people. And perhaps St. Paul in Romans helps us understand why. St. Paul says, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. War, the way we normally do it, is an attempt to overcome evil with even greater evil. Perhaps that's why today, on the anniversary of the armistice, words feel completely inadequate. And all we can really do is grieve that humanity has such a limited imagination and sense of justice. But of course, Remembrance Day is not just about philosophies and ideologies. Remembrance Day is also about remembering people, actual individuals that we know, we love, we care about. Individuals who, for many different reasons, decided to enlist and engage in the activity of war. Today, we may think primarily of those who volunteered to join the military during World War I and World War II, but you may be thinking of other wars as well. I imagine that most of us here today know individuals who fought in one war or another, people we cared about, perhaps friends, family, perhaps our own spouses or parents or children. And as we now are being asked to remember them, how will we remember them this year? Will we decide that a few prayers and a moment of silence is enough? Maybe. Will it be enough to go home and look through a photo album? Maybe. Will it be enough to spend time alone with our memories and maybe a tear or two? Maybe. Or will we decide to honor the memory of our loved ones who served and who died by taking seriously the words of Jesus? And I'm going to put it in very blunt terms, that Jesus said to leave vengeance to God, to not take up the arms of the enemy, to allow justice to flow instead of insisting we have to see ourselves as victorious. In short, do we hope, dream, live, and breathe into a future where peace is achieved through violence and war? Or do we hope, dream, live, and breathe into a future where peace is achieved through justice for all people? Because we have the right to decide for ourselves. We have the right to dream of a new and better world. We have the right to imagine and live into the kingdom of God right here. And we have the right to remember. We will remember them.